The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
A little more than 10 years ago, the Chicago Teachers Union points out that 41% of teachers in the Chicago public schools were black. Today, the CTU says that percentage has significantly decreased to just 25%. And that same trend is happening across the country. Why? That's the focus of our discussion on today's edition of The Professors. Joining us to talk about the lack of black teachers in Chicago and across the country are Michael Crenshaw, English professor at Daly College; David Stovall, Associate Professor of Educational Policy Studies and African American Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago; Chanel Harris-Smith, Communications Professor at Kennedy King College; and Brandon Johnson, Organizer and Deputy Political Director of the Chicago Teachers Union. Welcome all.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
All right. So Brandon, let's begin with your article. You wrote an article called Disappearing Acts in 2013. Can you give us just a good summary of it?
Yeah, basically it points out that the failed policies of school closings, the failed policy of the privatization of public schools, that the failed policies of disinvestment have overwhelmingly impacted black educators. That exists primarily because where you've seen the proliferation of the privatization of public schools, that happens in black communities. And so when schools are closed, turned over and turned around, black teachers overwhelmingly teach in black communities. And so when those schools are disinvested in, when funding is cut off, and when schools are closed, that's the consequence of those policies.
And are you saying that as a result of that, that issue needs to be on the table when they discuss school closures and opening new schools?
Well, I think when we're discussing the issue of how to make schools better, we should be talking about investing in schools. I think having this conversation at the table exposes the fact that when you attack public education, it's also an attack on black labor. And that's the bigger issue.
Now, some people would argue, does it matter? Well, let me ask you this, Michael. Does it matter whether this is intentional or unintentional?
From my perspective, no. Excuse me. And the reason why I say it doesn't matter to me or any of my colleagues is because we look at this completely differently when it comes to teaching in black public schools. The fact of the matter is that for us, the money's just not good enough. I'm just gonna go there, and I know that's controversial, but the money's just not good enough. Excuse me. I was just on CTU's website today and just taking a look at the average starting salary. Not the average, but starting salary of a teacher coming into the Chicago public school is anywhere from $49,000 to $56,000 a year. Whereas if I have a master's degree in engineering, we know about engineering from the University of Illinois, or if I have a master's degree in finance, or if I have a master's degree in computers, or even nursing, I'm starting at $30,000 to $40,000 to sometimes $50,000 a year at a higher salary. So why would I want to get a master's degree, go through all of the training and everything that it takes to be a teacher, only to end up still living close to poverty when it comes to working? A lot of my colleagues and I, we look at it from that standpoint. If you're not paying well, and I've gone through all this education to get to this point, why would I go through with it?
Well then, David, let's go to you then. So you do educational policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. In what way does pay play into this conversation about the decline of black teachers?
I think I'm going to divert a little bit because I don't think it is as much the pay. I want to return to Brandon's point around there's this issue around disinvestment, displacement. There's also retirements, and that the teaching force hasn't actually been replenished with black teachers since the 70s.
Well, that is true. It's interesting you should bring that out because I know we did ironically, when I was in library school down at Champaign, we had those conversations of when we had discussions about, librarian, where you're going to go into an administrative track. But we actually had in our classroom discussions that looked at you know, the anticipation of retirement. And so around about when you're in your, you know, your 15th year in your profession, this is when you should see a huge opening of administrators. And sure enough, they were right, because they knew they were able to project those numbers. Are you saying that within the public school environment, or maybe even within the education of teachers, they're not having that higher level conversation?
Yes, and we see this at UIC. So we have the last black male to graduate undergraduate elementary education at UIC was 2008.
Wow.
So now, if we look at those particular spaces, and so again, looking at, there are people who want to be there, but now do we have all of these boundaries and barriers that prevent them from getting there? So we have now this new test called Education Teacher Performance Assessment, where somebody actually tapes you teaching, sends that tape to someone away from where you're teaching to evaluate you. And what we know about schools and classrooms is that they're all contextual. So why would a person be evaluating you not understanding the context, just in terms of a sheet of paper that they've seen from the professor who wrote about the school context?
But then, David, let's revisit Michael's remarks. If we know that there's a huge gap in the, not only the availability of these teaching positions, right? But then you're saying that there's also a disparity in the pool of candidates. Why isn't compensation considered part of one of those key contributing factors on how do you recruit more?
I think when we look at people who are actually interviewing who want to be there and why they want to teach, compensation is probably the last thing, because of the actual...
We definitely don't teach because we want to be wealthy.
Right, so this thing, but again, one of the things that we've seen is that a lot of times people find the process of entering colleges of education to be excruciatingly difficult, and then actually push away from teaching. Because I don't want to dismiss compensation, but I think that there's some other spaces that contribute to that understanding.
Okay. Chanel, what's your input?
Well, you asked, you know, if this whole whitewashing of the teacher force is intentional or unintentional, and if that matters. I think it does matter. Brandon's article, I pointed out a few things. You know, this corporatization of education, and that threatens our realization of blackness, and then the destabilization of black communities. That's important. I believe it is intentional. When you take black teachers out of black schools, you know, those children are threatened. You know, we talked about the formative years, K through 6. If you don't see images of yourself, and if your teachers cannot see themselves in you, that's going to be a struggle for that student, that small child who is learning how to love him or herself, who's learning how to become a person, who's learning empathy, who's learning how to relate to the world, you know, and the people around them. Then if they don't have that, then that person is going to grow up at a disadvantage.
Then what is the response then to some of the discussions that says, okay, look, so are you saying that because I am a white teacher and I am in front of an all-black classroom that I am not as effective?
Absolutely not.
And how are we responding to that? Because, you know, people will hear what they want to hear. You know, you're like, I said this, but they heard this. So what exactly are we saying to ensure that we're being heard?
The teacher force needs to be diversified on many realms. There needs to be more men. There needs to be more black people. There needs to be more Asian people. There needs to be more gays and lesbians. It just needs to be diversified all over. It needs to reflect the world that we want to send our kids out into, or that we know we're going to send the kids out into, so they're ready.
But then is your argument, is part of your thesis then, Brandon, that because of the school closures and it has caused this huge vacuum, this significant decrease in black teachers, that needs to be a red flag issue?
It has to be, because when you're attacking public education, that's one fight, right? But when you are attacking the very sector that made the middle class possible, now you're dealing with the economic consequence of these failed policies. But it should not be lost in this conversation that white children need to benefit from black teachers as well, right? So I think it's a disservice to white children to not to have that context in front of them. But something that David said that I think is actually quite important. When we think about where half of our black teachers come from, they come from historically black colleges. We have the Secretary of Education right now, Arnie Duncan, who is not qualified to teach a classroom, but somehow has the authority to make policy, just actually reshifted the Parent Plus loan process, which now makes it harder for children, students to actually get the type of benefits to get through college, right? So when you start attacking those policies, there's no wonder, as David said, that we have less black folks to choose from because you have policies that are making it very difficult. Or as David said, it's excruciating because we just don't have the finances to get through college.
What are some of the other phenomena, the dynamics that come from having more black teachers in an urban setting where it is predominantly black?
Right. Well, I think there are two things that happen there, because I don't want your viewers to actually go with the understanding that just because you have a black teacher in front of black babies, that things are going to be
Right,
better.
because I know some black teachers who don't love the black babies.
Right. So this thing around what we're talking about is, can we cultivate and develop teachers who understand the larger justice condition in these particular communities?
So are you saying that they bring a level of empathy?
Not just empathy, but a notion of political consciousness and a knowledge of political economy. So the social, political, cultural, and economic things that affect that space in which they're working.
So they can speak to it differently.
So they can speak to it differently, and now their understanding of relevance is keyed into the young person being able to see themselves and making informed decisions on their world. So if we actually have a training ground where people are actually invested in young people and families being able to make informed decisions on their world, then classrooms look different. Principles look different. But again, this type of training, I think that's often what's missing. We actually prepare teachers on this method of hope, right? This thing around, we don't really give them the tools to engage, but then we say, let's go ahead, you'll be okay. But now, what would it mean to actually engage people with an in-depth understanding of their classroom, of the community in which they teach, of the young people, of the families, to make those issues relevant in the day-to-day?
Can I jump in here? I think, but see, this is I think we have people out there who have that type of motivation. I really believe that we have a lot of black educators who want to do that. But here's the thing, and going back to your article, here's the thing. Why would I want to deal with a city, and I'm going to keep with Chicago, why do I want to deal with a city that believes in closing schools in African-American neighborhoods? Why would I want to deal with a city if the schools are open, the buildings are dilapidated, the technology is terrible, and let's just go there. Not all parents are the most supportive parents in the world. Some are, but some aren't. Why would I want to deal with that when I can go to New York, for instance, where my brother teaches, because my brother teaches in a charter school. They actively recruit to where they say, not only do we want you to come to our charter school and teach, but we will even offer you room and board. So, I mean, they are actively seeking people to leave Chicago and come to New York. So my thing is, and let's just go there, and let's just be honest, put it all on the table. Why would I want to deal with all of this drama that goes on within the Chicago public school system? Because these teachers that we have, they got to go through a lot of drama. Why would I want to put up with that? For what?
Yeah, I mean, you put up with it because, and I think we talked about this a little bit, alluded to this earlier, is because you love your community, you love your neighborhood. Now, we should not lose sight of the fact that you're right. One of the number one reasons why black teachers leave the profession is lack of teacher autonomy. Right, it's not so much the conditions. That's the second thing, though. So to your point, and then I think pay is third or fourth. And so again, I think what we have to make sure that we're paying attention to, that the social and economic conditions that forces black folks out of these positions, that's where the greatest danger is. I don't think it's a coincidence that charter schools are recruiting black educators, because remember, many of these charter schools are not organized. Right, there's no labor components to it. And so again, if we can undermine the black labor force while at the same time undermining public education, now we're looking at all of the gains that we made through the civil rights movement are now under attack, right? And so when we lose those, the economic viability of our communities, when we lose the autonomy within public education, as David said earlier, the social, political, economic, I would even say religious component of what makes us exist, those components get lost, and that's dangerous for our people.
Well, they do get lost, and maybe then, David, you can speak to this, is that when we look at historically about, the enslavement of Africans, and then in the U.S., okay, we're just talking about the U.S. narrative. So we go from the enslavement of Africans, and then we talk about this state of being the freedmen, and then we talk about, I'm really fast forwarding here. Then we get to the 60s, and we get to the civil rights movement. Education has been a very heavy narrative throughout Black history in America, period. It has been considered, this is what will help deliver you. This is what will help save you. This is, because education was considered the great equalizer. And so it was an issue of, even back to, the issue of Brown versus Board, it was the issue of equity and access and things of that nature. So education has that very firm narrative. But there was an article that I read, let me see what I got here. It was Hilton 2012 in educational studies. She says that we, Hilton, we said we focus so much on that narrative that, this is how, how I come over, kind of narrative, that we focus so much on that discussion that then we began to not get to the real discussions of what are some of the educators, black educators, what are some of their theoretical frameworks, and then how does it apply to help inform and shape education in general? What do you say about that?
Well, I appreciate you going there. Let's really go there, right? Education in the United States for black people has never been purposefully intended to move them or to actually increase their ability to improve their condition. Every piece of education that was done that was focused in uplift was actually completed in spite of what public education systems were created to do. Right? So if we understand that, and now if we look at work like Gloria Ladson-Billings, Michelle Foster, Marvin Lin, who actually talk about what is that disposition of those black teachers who understand this larger justice condition around education. So not this narrative of I came over, but what is the responsibility, understanding that you exist in a hostile space? What will you do to improve that condition? And how will you work with others to improve that condition so we can actually work against this system that is not designed to educate folks by the authors of the system, right?
Well, let's take a snapshot then, because, I graduated from high school in the 80s. The 90s was the whole multicultural movement, right? So everybody was just into, diverse. It wasn't even, diversity wasn't the term that was thrown out. There was multiculturalism, right? And so when we went to college, there was the African American Center, and we had a lot of black teachers and things of that nature. And it just seemed like, okay, this is going good. It looks like things from the 60s is working out. It's, I hate to say trickle down, but it's working out. And then all of a sudden in 2000, now it's a problem. And now it's like, it's a vacuum that has pulled it out. And it's as if it's taking us back. It's like you move 2 steps forward only to get pushed back 3 steps. And that's how some of us are looking at it when we look at, whether it was an intentional or an unintentional effect of talking about, the whole destabilization of the black teaching profession in general. So what do we say about that?
Yeah, I would just add, if we take a step back to a few hundred years, remember when blacks were not able to get a college degree and we formed our own universities. Remember, colleges did not have to be accredited until black folks formed colleges, right? And so to David's point, that every time, or your point, every time we make some gains, they change the rules and they create these barriers. And so that same process has happened with these new cut scores, making it difficult for blacks to move through these very, very, in my opinion, subjective forms of assessment that prevents us from teaching. And I think the last point we need to make is that at the height of unionization, when more folks were protected by a union, is when you saw the achievement gap narrow between black and white students. And so when you have more black teachers, when you have more black teachers that were protected by labor, our children were learning. And so when we talk about the intentionality of this, in 2000, No Child Left Behind. 2008, Race to the Top, which has exacerbated the decline of black teachers because of failed policy.
I think we also, need to talk about those school closures in terms of the communities around those school closures. Now, when parents, buy into the charter school and that school is better and it's all shiny and new, it's got new computers and it's got all these pretty white teachers, we've got to rethink that whole idea. And when teachers, and when parents and teachers fought against those school closures, some of the words from those parents were saying, parents, we cannot divest from our neighborhood school. I'm a product of a neighborhood school. I went to my neighborhood school from 1st to 8th grade. About 50% of my teachers were African American. You talk to someone who was 70 years old, they'll say, maybe I had 1 or 2 white teachers. We can all speak from the space and say, what did that mean for us? It created, all these, concepts that you can't put on paper. I came up with all this self-esteem because I had all these strong black women teaching me in church and home, at home and at school. I could look at them and see myself. I had a black female pediatrician. So these things are disappearing from society, and we have to look at that and say, well, what does that mean? The child doesn't know math, but
But why isn't he or she not paying attention?
Right. Or does a child have a strong sense of self-respect? All these things that we cannot say, well, that's a 5 out of 10, and this is a, 10 out of 20.
But let me ask you this then. So, me, I always say every show, we describe the water while drowning. We get it. It's cold, it's dark. No one's coming to save us. There is no savior. So then what are some of the things that we can begin doing now to address this issue? I mean, I understand what you're saying, like there is no compensation. So do we say, okay, if you're here because you want the compensation, maybe this conversation is not for you? But I think sometimes when we talk about recruitment into education, we have to understand, like there are in some other professions, we understand that it is a service that we are providing. We are now committing ourselves to be a servant of the community. And so does that mean that, are we not compensated as much? You don't want to say, yeah, you got to take a poverty oath. But, I guess for some people they would say, well, that's pretty much what you're asking people to do. So how do we recruit more black professionals into the teaching profession? Or do we need to say, okay, well, maybe for those who are just coming out of college, maybe this is not a good career move for you. Maybe for those that are looking at a second career, maybe for those that are retiring from their professional or corporate background, maybe is that a new pool to recruit from?
I mean, I think you can recruit from multiple levels. I think, first of all, you have to protect those of us that are here.
Oh, well, touche.
So let's start there,
yes.
right?
Okay,
I think the second
start.
thing we can do is we need to invest in our historically black colleges because, again, there's a 50% chance that if a black student goes to HBCU, they want to come back in their community and teach. I think the third thing that we can do is invest in our black boys because black boys that grow up to become men and get bachelor's degrees, the overwhelming profession that they choose are professions that give back. So teachers, social workers, counselors. Look, people talk about the lack of black men inside of classrooms, but let's put this in some context. Black men only make up about 4 or 5% of the general population. 2% of the teachers are black men. If you think of the ratios, that's actually not that bad considering how we are situated globally or at least nationally. So as we invest more in black boys, the chances of a black boy wanting to be like me, David, or Mike, the chances are pretty high.
Right.
That's where we can recruit.
And I think also to that, I think we need to change the perception of education in the black communities. I cannot tell you how many times when I'm in my own classroom and I mention how many of you want to be a teacher, and maybe one person raises his or her hand. And so I will go the opposite route and I will ask, how come none of you want to teach? And all of and I know it's a generalization, I'm gonna say it anyway, all of the black men say, I had a horrible experience in high school.
That's critical.
It was terrible.
That's critical.
Education was bad. My teachers didn't care. Blah, blah. Yeah. So I think that we need to change that in high school. And then going into college, let's recruit the way a lot of these other businesses recruit. The Army, I mean, I can tell you right now, the Army, there was a time where they had a negative perception of, if you get into the Army, you automatically go to war, you're going to die. Now, if you look at, their commercials, they're talking about all the other things you can benefit from in terms of being in the Army. So I really do believe that we need to change what's going on in the high schools, change these black men and black women's perceptions of negative education. And then once we get into college, let's recruit the way these other
But then how do we change that perception if you just first by saying, ain't no money in the game? So I don't want to be bothered. So how do you change that perception?
Well, the thing, I think there's a piece around because folks don't come to teaching particularly for the dough. I think that's important to put on the table.
And let's be honest with you, in our profession, you probably don't want to teach next to someone who is in it for the money.
Exactly. So
they're not going to stay in the trenches wrong. Their commitment is totally there. And I love all my colleagues who have ascended from faculty to some administrative role, but then they end up becoming the pitch hitter, like I'm just waiting for that opportunity and then I'm out of here.
Well, I think the thing that we have not done, and this is again a shift in recruiting, if you actually take a group of young folks and say, hey, look, if you want to teach, here's how we'll support you. And more importantly, not through your undergrad.
But let me ask you that, but who says that? Because when I look at organizations such as Teach for America, whose sole mission is to recruit teachers to go into the charter schools, regardless of the charter school arrangement. You know, you don't have to be certified, blah, 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 blah. But when we look at the way that they recruit, they'll say, okay, we recruit from the top schools and those top students that have graduated from those top schools. And then I was just like, well, do you have a specific outreach to HBCUs? And it was kind of like, okay, we're working on it.
Well, this is the
so do we need do we need some kind of TFA?
We don't need that model. I'll say that.
Okay.
I'll say that off the top.
All right.
But I
and we got about 2 minutes, and then maybe we'll talk more about what that model looks like in the after show. But go ahead.
I think about an example is a program out of Clemson called Call Me Mister.
Got it.
So what they actually talk about is, hey, look, they go to black males in the Carolinas, North and South, and say, look, you want to teach? We got you. Not only will we get you for that 4 years of undergrad, we'll support you in years 1 through 3 of teaching, because that's when the majority of people leave.
Got it.
Right? So this type of thing around being very intentional about that. So that intentional recruitment and then support throughout undergrad into teaching.
What do you think about that, Brandon?
We actually have to have a political program as well, right, to help shift this narrative, right? When you have a mayor of Chicago like Rahm Emanuel that is dead set on destroying public sector workers, dead set on destroying public education, you got to change the political landscape. When you have a lieutenant governor nominee like Paul Vallis that ushered in the closing of schools and the loss of black teachers nationally and globally, we also have to have a political strategy to elect people that are actually connected to these issues so that we can actually solve and protect this profession.
Chanel, let you have the last
That
word.
support, we got to have the support for teachers. I agree with Dr. Stovall. We have to have the support in the years that we know that teachers are, revolving on out the door, because they haven't felt supported, they haven't felt isolated, and that's black and white teachers alike. I've seen excellent teachers, black, white, and they have not been supported. They haven't been supported, and we got the teachers have to be able to relate to those children in whatever way that is. So you can't be getting the 1% to teach the 99% all day, every day. It has to be more diverse.
And it is
just
a little
has to be
danger
more
to that,
diverse.
because what happens is they start teaching on this revisionist lens, trying to correct certain behaviors or certain ideologies or fallacies that they may hold on to. All right, so we're looking forward to our conversation afterwards. We're going to talk a little bit more about Clemson and what it looks like. That's our show for today. The conversation continues online at wycc.org. See you next time on The Professors.